Hello, this is Kyle, also known as AlienTude, reviewing today this Albion Next Generation Principe. Now, real quick, that name, Principe, I have heard it called the way I'm pronouncing it, Principe. I've also heard it pronounced the Principe. I don't know which is right. I tend to call it Principe. I asked Mike from Albion, and he said it doesn't really matter. He calls it Principe. That's why I'm going with that. Now this sword sells new for in a range of 1645 to 1761, depending on your hilt options. This is the oxblood grip with a blackened hilt, which brings the total to 1700. I think it's 1709 total. That's a lot of money, obviously. That gets you where you could get a high-end sword from, say, Valiant Armory with a scabbard. So this is an expensive production sword. What do you get for that price? Well, that's what this review is going to go over. You should know that I did buy this sword. It is not a review sample, loaner, anything like that. So this sword is an example of a Oakshot Type 18C, which is a very noticeable model because the blades are broad. Look, I mean, you can see that they're broad and they're generally relatively thin. There's not a ton of examples of them. There are multiple in different museums, but they all seem to stem from, at least all the existing ones seem to stem from the Alexandria arsenal. And that is why these are sometimes referred to as Alexandria swords. In fact, there is a famous model, a famous one in the Met Museum at New York that many people call the Alexandria, and it's what the Albion Alexandria is primarily based off. There is some differences there. Anyways, the Principe takes that same blade that Albion makes for the Alexandria and marries it to a different style of hilt with a longer grip, different pommel, different crossguard. So let's take a look at the hilt here. I'm going to talk about the grip first because it's the most notable thing to me, because I generally don't like this thicker cord texture. I usually like that fine cord texture with risers that is, I would say, more common on both Albions and in the reproduction market in general. I usually don't like this one. I really like it on the Principe. It works. It gives me a really good grip. I can't rotate the sword at all. And part of that is that thicker cord. It makes the whole grip a little bit beefier, which I usually don't like, but it works on this sword because this is a big, beefy sword and it needs a grip that is consummate to that. So the grip works. It's relatively simple in shape, starts pretty wide here, not particularly thick. It does swell a little bit in thickness right there, and it tapers pretty evenly towards the pommel. Overall, it's a very comfortable grip. I can get two hands on it very easily without interacting with the pommel at all. Moving on to the pommel, I can also grip at the pommel very well. This is kind of a fishtail style pommel, and it's very easy to grip if I want to separate my hands to get more leverage to help drive the cut more. And it works very well. That's intentional on this sword. This sword is very much intended as a cutting-focused sword and a modern cutting-focused sword. So it's got design features specifically for people who like to cut, the modern HEMA enthusiasts who like to do cutting also. That longer grip, the grippable pommel, that's all kind of tailored to the modern audience. And that's why you'll sometimes hear this sword as kind of a made-up sword, I've heard people call to it, because it's not really, this hilt configuration is not really based on any Type 18C blades that I'm aware of, at least. Anyways, the pommel is this beautiful fishtail style. It's got this blackening on it. I've seen Albion do a couple different styles of blackening. Some I've seen are just jet black and just perfectly smooth and even, and it looks really good. This is not that. This is more of a blackening with some grain and a little bit of blotchiness, and that looks really good. I have yet to see an Albion blackening that doesn't look really good, but I think this one in particular, with this oxblood grip, with the blade, everything, it just looks really, really nice. I really like the way the blackening came here. And of course, the peen, you can't even really see it on this model. I'm sure close-up photography will show it, but just looking at it, it's barely visible. Smoothed over very, very well. The crossguard has these nice little flares out into bulb tips. Now, I'm usually not a huge fan of this style of quillin tip. I don't really like that swell out, even though it's a very common style on Albions and historic swords. But I really like it here. Again, I think there's something just so perfectly designed about the Principe. It just looks right. I think this crossguard looks excellent. The blackening here looks excellent. It's round here, so everything is perfectly smooth. Absolutely no chance of a hot spot. And of course, where the blade meets the crossguard, the gap is tiny. Now this is a pretty flat blade, so it's not a particularly difficult gap to fit, but it still does show a lot of attention to detail. So moving on to what I consider to be the star of the show is the enormous blade, and it is exactly what I said. It's huge. It starts around 3 inches wide at the base, has a lot of profile taper, but still manages to stay a good, that looks to me like about 1.5 inches wide up towards the center of percussion, which hopefully you can see the demonstration there. It doesn't have a ton of vibration to it, but it stays broad throughout. And if I flex it, it's got some flex, but really only in the last little bit, and not a lot, to be frank. It's balanced also very close to the guard, around 2.5 inches or so. We'll get into that when I start talking about handling and cutting. But overall, the blade is beautiful. It's got that even finish that Albion does very well. Although I do notice on this blade, there's not in the geometry of the blade, but there's like lines across the finish where you can see where the polishing wheels or whatever were grinding this and finishing it off. There's no actual rippling. If I look down actually no, there is some very tiny rippling in the surface of the blade, but I'm talking very, very minor. You can barely see it. I assume this is because it's, again, a relatively thin blade. It does not start particularly thick, and it gets quite thin out here because it's designed for cutting. So optimized for cutting. The center ridge is beautifully straight. It's not particularly crisp. Again, it is a thin blade. And the edges, of course, are perfectly straight. There's no wobbling around or anything. The tip is ever so slightly asymmetrical, but we're talking very, very minor details here. Overall, it's a beautiful blade. But of course, aesthetics, while they are great, and I think this sword nails them, the real reason for this sword, for most people to buy this sword, is cutting. It is a hyper-focused cutting blade that still can thrust. It has an acute point, and it is relatively rigid, so it can definitely thrust some. But it is by far and away a very cut-focused sword. And how does it cut? Well, I took it to the backyard for my normal targets, water bottles, some paper cartons, that kind of thing. Now, before I start actually showing you any of that footage, I should say this is the stock edge from Albion. Typically, I find Albion's stock edge is sharp enough to do the job barely, but sharp enough to do the job. It's not going to do you any favors in the cut. It's certainly not what I would consider competition level sharp. That's Albion's normal edge. How about the edge on this specific one? This is probably the sharpest Albion I've seen straight from them. It is not competition level sharp here, but it can deliver very good cuts. In fact, this cut right here on this milk carton shocked the hell out of me. The bottom didn't even move during that. It's a beautiful cut. But what's interesting, when I looked at it, it was still doing a little bit of tearing in this cut. That's to show that shows that the edge is still not quite at that hair popping sharpness. You know, it's sharp enough to do backyard cutting, but it's still not going to really get to that level where it just sings through targets. It is definitely sharp enough, but not quite there. And in terms of how it is to swing around and move, in the cut, very easy to move around. That close point of balance means you can really deliver good acceleration very quickly, very easily, and you can also pivot the sword around. You can go from one cut to another without too much difficulty. Now it is a heavy sword. It is nearly 4 pounds. This one is 3 pounds, 15.5 ounces. So basically 4 pounds really, but it doesn't feel that heavy because there's a lot of weight in the hilt, which really helps balance the overall sword. That's talking about handling though, so I'm kind of jumping around a little bit. Let's move on to what most people who would buy one of these would want, at least what I would consider what most people who buy one of these would want to do, which is tatami cutting. Again, not competition level sharp, but sharper than Albion's norm and definitely sharp enough to do the job if your technique is on. Now, my technique, generally speaking, is not good enough, but I was able to get some very clean, good cuts. And at the first couple cuts on tatami, I kind of started failing. This session I cut tatami with, I was quite rusty, to be frank. And it was pretty chilly outside for me in Southern California. There was multiple conditions that led to not having the best cutting session. But this sword did better than I expected. Now, there's a huge part of that is the fact that it's slightly sharper, a little bit sharper than Albion's norm, but also the geometry of the blade is just hyper-focused on cutting. It's very thin out in the sweet spot and with a wide blade, so the edge angle is very acute. It's very conducive to cutting. So I can see why, of Albion's models, this is one of the most popular models for cutting in cutting competitions. It's really focused on doing that very, very well. And to give you an example of just how well it can cut, here's some video from my friend Matthew Cross, who uses a Principe as his cutting competition longsword. Here's just a couple examples of him. So yeah, you can see this sword cuts tatami superbly now in the right hands. Now that is also sharpened. Matthew does excellent sharpening and he has very good technique. So his cuts were beautiful. But it shows what's possible with this sword. So I already touched on handling quite a bit during that cutting section, but I'm going to point out a few more things that I've thought of. First off, despite this weighing nearly 4 pounds, it is not as tiring as some other swords that weigh less even. Like I recently reviewed that Winter Cutlery Type 17 Shalia sword, and that sword was more tiring to use than this one, despite being about half a pound lighter. Why is that? Point of balance. Being that this is balanced so close to the guard, it makes it easier to accelerate the tip and just easier overall to move around and cut with. Whereas that Type 17, it had a point of balance that's quite a bit further out, designed for more power. And that sword, based on that, makes it harder to accelerate the tip, makes it more tiring for me to use. So despite this weighing nearly 4 pounds, it doesn't feel like that in the hand. You pick it up, it's got some heft, but you feel a lot of that heft in the hilt, and it doesn't feel like I am lifting a 4-pound sword. In fact, I can even move it around one-handed shockingly easily for a 4-pound sword. You know, that blows me away, frankly. This is masterfully designed to not feel as heavy as it is. Now, as a Type 18C, this is also the heaviest that I've handled. I've handled a decent number of 18Cs. The Valor Arms Alexandria, much lighter than this. I have a review of a Winter Cutlery Type 18C that's going to be coming out 2 weeks after this review, definitely lighter. My competition cutting longsword is a Sterling Armory 18C, which is also lighter. This feels comparable to most of those though. It doesn't feel that extra weight. So yeah, this is just a really interesting feeling sword. Much more nimble than I would expect it to be. It's overall a lot of fun to move around. I really actually enjoy moving this around, cutting with it. I think I might at some point want to get it that extra sharpening so I can really see what it does to tatami. And who knows, maybe it'll end up taking over my competition cutting spot. I have a couple other swords that are knocking on the door of saying, I want to take that spot. So it's going to be, which one do I end up liking the most? Which one am I most effective with the most? At this point, it's still my Sterling Armory 18C. That sword is. But anyways, this sword's a lot of fun to move around, a lot of fun to handle. It surprises me how much fun it is to move around. So this sword is right around $1,700, depending on the exact options you choose. Is it worth that price? Well, let's add in some more things to think about. If you buy from Albion, if you just place an order with them, you've got at least a 2-year wait. A lot of people, that's unacceptable. It doesn't bother me too much, but if you're looking at buying just one sword, or you have a small collection, you want another sword, a 2-year wait is considerable. So there's a definite downside there. Now you can go to cons, SoCal Sword Fight, Combat Con are the two that Albion goes to. This year is the last Combat Con, so I don't know if Albion's going to go to anything besides SoCal Sword Fight after Combat Con retires. But regardless, you can go to them, and pretty often Albion will bring a Principe to those. In fact, I've seen them bring 2 to 3 Principes before. In addition, the Principe is one of the most common models that Kult of Athena stocks. I don't think they have any in stock at time of recording, but it is one of the most common models they get in stock. Now you do have to pay a little bit extra with Kult of Athena if you have sales tax where you live, but you get to skip a 2-year wait. So all that being said, $1,700, 2-year wait potential, all that. I think this sword is worth it. I really enjoy owning this sword. I think it is absolutely a stunner aesthetically. It fits in my collection very, very well, and it is a lot of fun to use. So for me, yes, it is absolutely worth the price. Now keep in mind, I am somebody who likes to cut with my swords, and I am trying to improve my technique and get better at cutting tatami and competing at cutting tatami. So this sword is a little bit more up my alley than some people that you might just collect swords for fun just to have and not actually use, and that's fine. Whether or not this sword appeals to you, that depends on your taste. Now, I do want to say there are options for an 18C if you don't want to pay, if you can't afford $1,700. Take a look at the Valor Arms Alexandria. That is an excellent option. I did do a review of it. I will link that in the description. So there's options. You don't need to get the Principe to have an 18C. But the Principe is kind of one of the most iconic swords on the current reproduction market. It's one of Albion's most famous swords. It has such a unique look. There's something about it that just says yes to me. So that's why I love it so much. To me, my collection would not be complete without this sword in it. So for me, absolutely it's worth the asking price. And that's going to wrap up my review of this Albion Next Generation Principe. Thank you for watching. Make sure you hit the like button, leave a comment, subscribe, all that YouTube stuff. Until next time, Alien Tude out.